Welcome to Swords and Hammers. Truth comes clothed in tales, and the soul remembers what the mind alone forgets. The world is loud, but for the next few minutes, it can wait. Take a moment, settle yourself, listen well. Come, let us begin. The road to Bethel. The mantle was heavier than he had imagined. It was not the weight of the wool, but the weight of the fire that clung to it still. Elisha walked the Jericho road, a solitary figure against the sun-scorched earth. But his mind was in the whirlwind. He could still feel the heat of the heavenly chariot on his face, still smell the scent of lightning that had split the air when his master, Elijah, was taken. The world had been torn open, and he had been left behind to stitch it closed. On his shoulders now rested the authority of God in a land that had forgotten God's name. It was not a trophy. It was armor for a battle he did not choose, but could not refuse. His journey was a march into the heart of the sickness. He walked away from Jericho, the place of first victories, and set his face toward Bethel, the house of God. But the name was now a lie. A bitter irony whispered on the wind. For Bethel, where the patriarchs had met with heaven, was now the capital of an earthly hell, the seat of a counterfeit faith where a golden calf was king. He was a single drop of pure water falling into a poisoned well. The conflict was not a matter of if, but when. As the walls of Bethel rose in the distance, the very air seemed to thicken. The sounds were wrong, not the solemn chants of true worship, but the hollow laughter of a permanent festival. Near the city gate, a market thrived, and Elisha saw them, small, polished idols laid out on blankets, their dead eyes staring into the unforgiving sun. He heard a snatch of conversation between two merchants, a shared, cynical joke about the pronouncements of the calf's priests. This was the disease of Bethel. It was not a simple, brutish paganism. It was a sophisticated mockery. It kept the language of faith, but had hollowed it out, leaving only the husk of ritual to conceal a core of contempt. The city itself felt like a fortress, its walls built not of stone, but of scorn. A place that had made a sacrament of sneering at the holy. They were catechized in cynicism, these people. They had been taught that nothing was sacred, so that their own sins could be comfortable. And as Elisha, the last true thing in a world of copies, approached the gate, the city's immune system took notice. The infection had found its antibody. They came out from the city, a tide of them. Not small children, as some have later told the tale to soften it. No, these were young men, with the cruelty of knowledge in their eyes. They were old enough to know the weight of their words, and they chose the heaviest they could find. It began with one voice, a low jeer from the back of the crowd. Then another joined in, and another, until it became a chorus, a liturgical chant of rebellion. A ringleader, his face a mask of arrogant piety, stepped forward. He pointed a finger, not at the man, but at the mantle. "Go up, you bald head," he sneered, and the mob took up the cry. "Go up, you bald head! Go up, you bald head!" It was a creed of damnation sung in unison. Every word was a poisoned dart. "Go up!" The cynical mockery of the holy fire that had taken Elijah. They were saying, if your God is real, why doesn't he snatch you away too? Vanish. Disappear. We do not want your kind here. And bald head. Not a mere insult about his appearance. It was a theological curse. It meant counterfeit, for Elijah was a hairy man. It meant unclean, for it was the mark of the leper. It meant outcast. They were not merely mocking a man. They were publicly excommunicating the authority of the living God from their land. They were stripping the prophet of his office, his dignity, and his divine commission with their tongues. The chanting reached a fever pitch. The air was thick with hatred, and Elisha stopped. He turned. The world seemed to hold its breath. He did not look at them with the wounded eyes of a man insulted. He looked at them with the terrible clarity of an ambassador whose king has been defamed. His gaze was not hot with personal anger. It was cold with divine authority. In his eyes, they did not see a victim. They saw a judge. The mob faltered for a half-second, silenced by the sheer weight of that look, and into that silence Elisha spoke. His voice was not a shout of rage. It was the low, steady sound of a stone being set in place, a verdict being rendered. He did not curse them in his own name. He did not invent a punishment from his own wounded pride. He simply opened his mouth and let the law of God speak through him. He pronounced the judgment that was already written against those who mock the name of the Lord. Then came the silence, a different kind of silence. Not the pause in the mob's shouting, but a deep, unnatural quiet that fell over the whole world. The birds stopped singing, the wind suddenly died, and the cynical laughter froze on 42 faces. And from the woods beside the road came a sound, a rustle, a heavy tread. Two shadows detached themselves from the deeper shadows of the trees. They were she-bears, summoned not by chance, but by a will far older than the forest. They were not mere beasts. They were ministers of a justice that the young men had denied even existed. Creation itself was rising to defend its creator. The judgment was not chaotic. It was swift, specific, and terrible. The bears moved through the crowd like a reaping hook through wheat. It was God's answer to Bethel's challenge. They had demanded a sign, a supernatural act. "Go up!" they had sneered, and the supernatural had come down. It was God's sermon to a city that had grown deaf to words, preached now in a language of violence they could never forget. And when it was over, the silence returned. Deeper, heavier. The road to Bethel was consecrated anew, not by a blessing, but by a judgment. Vindicated and terrible, the prophet turned and continued his journey. That is the wage for mocking the servant. But what then is the wage for mocking the Son? For another prophet would one day walk another road toward another city that had forgotten God. He too would be met by a chorus of contempt. He too would be stripped of dignity and declared unclean. They would spit on him and press a crown of thorns onto his head and mock him as a counterfeit king. And at the height of their mockery, this greater prophet also turned and looked upon them. But here the story shatters into grace. For Elisha, the servant, pronounced the curse of the law, and judgment fell upon the guilty. But Jesus the Son looked upon a world of mockers, a world that includes us all, and he did not pronounce the curse. He absorbed it. The bears of God's righteous wrath, the judgment that should have torn us apart, fell upon him instead. He was torn so that the mockers could be made whole. He became the outcast so that we could be brought home. That is the terrible paradox that stands at the center of all things. The only path away from the judgment of Bethel leads to the foot of a hill called Calvary. Selah.